showing strength and courage. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy is shooting down claims that Republicans will cut entitlements in their negotiations over raising the debt ceiling. In an interview Friday, McCarthy said Republicans won't touch Medicare or Social Security. Earlier this week, McCarthy said he wanted to trim government spending unrelated to entitlement programs. House Republicans are demanding spending cuts as a price for lifting the debt ceiling. 37 years ago today, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded shortly after launch from Cape Canaveral, Florida. All 7 astronauts, including Krista McCullough, who was to be the first teacher in space, were killed in the disaster. Earlier this week, NASA held Day of Remembrance at the Johnson Space Center to honor the fallen astronauts of the Challenger, Columbia, and Apollo 1 who died in the service of their country. I'm Julie Ryan. A senior ISIS leader and 10 other ISIS fighters are dead following a U.S. military raid in northern Somalia. Mark Mayfield reports.
Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a statement that Bilal al-Sudani, who is described as a key operative and facilitator in the ISIS network, was the target of the raid. Austin said al-Sudani was responsible for fostering ISIS in Africa and funding worldwide operations. President Biden ordered the raid following a recommendation from Austin and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley. Officials say no civilians were injured, but did not identify any of the others killed, besides saying they were ISIS operatives.
New York City Mayor Eric Adams is changing his tune about Congressman George Santos. Lisa G. has more.
Just weeks after vowing to work with the embattled Long Island representative, Adams says it's time for him to leave and is urging Santos to resign. Adams' remarks to WCBS come as offensive social media posts that Santos made about Adolf Hitler were reported. Adams said, "What you see is something that is unimaginable," and added Santos will get in the way of what needs to be done in Congress this year.
The Powerball jackpot continues to grow, and that means there's an even bigger prize up for grabs in tonight's drawing. Here's Brad Siegel.
The jackpot has risen to $572 million after no one correctly picked the winning numbers in Wednesday night's drawing. The cash option for tonight's drawing, about $309 million. The odds of hitting the jackpot are 1 in more than 292 million. The cost of the ticket is $2. The Powerball jackpot hasn't been won since November. The numbers will be drawn tonight just before 11 o'clock Eastern Time.
Reba McEntire is a restaurant owner. The grand opening for Reba's Place was Thursday night in Atoka, Oklahoma, a town with a population around 3,000, about 2 hours southeast of Oklahoma City. The 3-story restaurant, bar, retail, and entertainment venue is just a few miles from where McEntire grew up. I'm Julie Ryan.
And I'm Susanna Palmer in the Bloomberg Newsroom. More protests are expected today across New York and New Jersey following the release Friday of that body cam video showing Memphis police officers brutally beating Tyree Nichols. Mayor Eric Adams acknowledged the anger protesters feel ahead of last night's demonstrations around the area.
As a human being, I am devastated. As a mayor, I am outraged.
Officials have been calling for peaceful protests. FTX co-founder Sam Bankman-Fried's lawyer insisted today his client didn't seek to influence a witness in the U.S. government's fraud case against him, accusing prosecutors of trying to portray him, quote, in the worst possible light. Mark Cohen, a lawyer for Bankman-Fried, asked the federal judge presiding over the case to allow his client to meet some people involved in FTX, saying his client needs to participate in his defense. Cohen says Bankman-Fried's use of Signal to reach out to the current general counsel of FTX, who is a witness, was just meant to help with the processing of FTX's bankruptcy and doesn't reflect misconduct. New York taxpayers, you will be footing the bill for former Governor Andrew Cuomo's legal defense in a civil suit filed by a one-time member of his security detail who accused him of sexual harassment. That, according to a New York State court judge. The decision yesterday is a setback for New York Attorney General Letitia James, who in April declined Cuomo's request to have the state cover his legal costs. Cuomo, who argued that the alleged harassment took place while he was a state employee, sued James in August to overcome her decision. Goldman Sachs Group cut Chief Executive Officer David Solomon's compensation by about 30%, down to $25 million for 2022. We hear more about that from Bloomberg's Charlie Pellet.
It was a year in which the share price and profit tumbled, and the firm retreated from a highly public effort to create a consumer bank. According to a filing, the package includes a $2 million base salary and $23 million in variable compensation, with $16.1 million of that in the form of restricted stock units. Charlie Pellet, Bloomberg Radio.
Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Susanna Palmer. Now let's get a check of Bloomberg Sports.
At the Australian Open, Arina Sabalenka wins her first Grand Slam title, defeating Elena Rybakina in 3 sets. On Sunday, Novak Djokovic will face Stefanos Tsitsipas for the men's title. The Knicks play the Nets at Barclays. The Nets won the first meeting by 27 in early November. ESPN reports the Mets and National League batting champion Jeff McNeil have agreed to a 4-year extension worth $50 million. A LeBron James Miami Heat jersey from Game 7 of the 2013 NBA Finals has sold at auction for $3.7 million. That's a Bloomberg Sports Update. I'm Joel Stern.
This is Bloomberg Best. Bloomberg Radio is everywhere.
Always accurate and precise.
Bloomberg's really one of the places that's reporting facts.
Your communication capabilities are wonderful for our business. I'm Ed Baxter.
And I'm Denise Pellegrini. On this weekend edition of Bloomberg Best,
Will the Fed hike more than investors expect?
It's a personal judgment. I'd go for 50.
what happens as the Fed eases out of mortgage-backed securities?
Who are the private investors and what will they require in terms of yields to hold that?
Johnson & Johnson says traditional advertising isn't what it used to be.
Today, it's much more likely that a Kardashian social media post or a Jennifer Aniston social media post has a lot more influence.
And Ironman Cal Ripken on scoring with youth baseball.
It all starts when they're very young. These kids are willing to put time in, specialize in a sport.
Bloomberg Best. Bloomberg's best stories of the week. Powered by 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries around the world.
Of course, the big event we're all watching is the Fed's Open Market Committee. It is gearing up to meet this coming week.
Yeah, that's right, Denise. And Philadelphia Fed President Patrick Harker says more hikes are coming.
I expect that we will raise rates a few more times this year.
And John Williams, president of the New York Fed, well, he's echoing Harker's view.
Monetary policy, there still is more work to do.
Now, Federal Reserve Governor Chris Waller, meantime, among those calling for a small hike.
Currently favor a 25 basis point increase at the FOMC's next meeting.
And that was something echoed by Harker.
Hikes of 25 basis points will be appropriate going forward.
St. Louis Fed President Jim Bullard says after the Fed hikes, it's going to keep things there for a while.
The Fed is going to have to maintain rates at high enough levels.
But Mohammed El-Arian, Bloomberg opinion columnist and chief economic advisor over at Allianz, well, he says the Fed may hike more than some investors are expecting on February 1st.
There's support from data, depending on what you look at. If you want to go to the 25 camp, you look at the retail sales numbers, you look at the Cove inversion, the 50, you look at the labor market, and there's downside risks to both. So it's a really interesting debate. I'm not sure there is the right answer, and then you have to factor in what the market is pricing, which is not what the Fed is telling us, and the credibility issue. I think if you put all that together, I would go personally for 50. And that's because I think inflation is going to get sticky in mid-year around 4%. And I'd rather get the tightening out of the way now than when the economy weakens. But it's tough. It's a personal judgment. I'd go for 50.
Okay, so that was Mohammed El-Arian, Bloomberg opinion columnist and also chief economic advisor at Allianz.
Of course, we'll be getting 4 new voting members of the Fed's Open Market Committee as others cycle out.
Austin Goolsbee of the Chicago Fed, Philly's Patrick Harker, who we heard from earlier, and Minneapolis, Neil Kashkari, and Dallas, Lori Logan.
We can, and if necessary, should adjust our overall policy strategy to keep financial conditions restrictive, even as the pace slows.
She's fairly dovish, Denise, but measured.
Yeah, and among Logan and the other 3 new ones, and all except Kashkari are pretty much considered either neutral, like you mentioned, or even dovish.
Yeah, of course, Denise. How long the Fed will keep rates higher has some investors worried.
But Binky Chadha, chief global strategist and head of asset allocation at Deutsche Bank, well, he tells Bloomberg's Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz
some investors might be a little too pessimistic.
Actually, what we have in terms of our outlook for this year is really the rally in Q1, which we think of as basically a continuation of the rally that began late last year. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as, sort of a bullish view on fundamentals. The basic driver of the rally, in our view, is really a positioning squeeze. As we know, since late April of last year, it's all really been about the central banks. And if you look at our measures of positioning, the fundamental investors, we call them the discretionary equity investors, very quickly moved down to neutral to slightly negative. What got squeezed as a result of the last 6 months of last year is really systematic strategies. Systematic strategies tend to follow the market. So to have this big divide between systematic strategies, 2 Z-scores below neutral, let alone where they most of the time...
I flunked that on the CFA. Vicki, let me cut to the chase. Ralph Ankapour in technical analysis is adamant we made an October low in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. He's as bullish as you are. So there's a short squeeze. We're squeezing out the gloom. I get that.
Yeah.
What's the then what after we squeeze out the gloom for you and Mr. Ankapour?
So, we have our year-end target, which, yes, I understand it looks bullish. I would say it's only a little bit more than 10% up from where we've been recently. We see most of that happening basically in Q1. And then we have basically, as you know, a call for a recession in the U.S. Starting in Q3. So second quarter, keeping in line with the recession playbook historically. We have the market going sideways, so that's still 4,500. We have, if the recession happens in Q3, a pretty severe sell-off, which would take us all the way down to 3,250. But I think, very important aspect of the recession playbook to keep in mind if you're thinking out 12 months is that equities, pretty robustly bottom about halfway through. So if you have a 2-quarter recession, they will come all the way back basically in Q4. And so my Q1 target is my year-end target. Yeah.
You said something pretty radical, that it's all been about the Fed. It is not necessarily about some of these other issues, like earnings, which we keep getting and a lot of people keep looking at.
Sure.
So how do you push back against that, and how much do you expect tech to continue to lead, regardless of the up or the down, because of that macro play?
Yeah, so tactically our call is to be, the rally will be led by tech and the financials, and some of the consumer cyclicals where, priced in 120% of an average recession. I think it starts to make things pretty asymmetric.
Right now I'm watching earnings, and people are saying there's a real fundamental shift underneath the market, that you have tech that's not necessarily going to lead in growth, even though they now are leading in returns, simply because of cuts, et cetera. And I'm wondering whether you see that, whether we're heading back to a different normal in terms of leadership, or whether we're heading back to the same regime. It's just sort of dependent on the Fed.
So, in terms of earnings for the year as a whole, if you put in a recession in there like we have, we're talking about $195. So the question is, what happens if the alternative, which is a very popular question given the market price action, and it's more likely to go sideways and even just start to recover. I think in terms of thinking about earnings, everybody talks always about growth rates. I think it's also important to keep in mind where the levels are. Equity valuations come off of levels, and earnings have been running, sort of well above trend levels, and so we have this issue where I mean, even if you looked at real activity, the good side of the economy, it's essentially been going sideways for 2 years now.
Venki Chadha, Chief Global Strategist and Head of Asset Allocation at Deutsche Bank, with Bloomberg's Tom Keene and Lisa Abramowitz.
Of course, not everyone is as exuberant as Venki Chadha.
Right, Denise. Like Elizabeth Burton, Client Investment Strategist at Goldman Sachs Asset Management.
Yes, she told Bloomberg's Alex Steele and Guy Johnson she's eyeing an earnings recession. Check this out.
I think we're going to see pressure on earnings for sure. I think this might look a little bit like a 2008 or a 2020 where we continue to see negative earnings revisions going forward, but I don't think that's a giant surprise. I think a lot of us anticipated earnings pressure going into the holiday season, the amount of discounting and sales that we saw on the retail side, and I think that's going to continue, that we're going to see companies struggle with passing through the margin increases, and it's going to translate into more difficult earnings scenario. Nevertheless,
U.S., though, the equity market's done really well. I mean, there's been a lot of money going into Europe as well. And is there like a FOMO thing happening, regardless of what the numbers tell us?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it, FOMO. I've been traveling a lot for the last couple weeks, and the number one thing I've noticed when talking to investors is there seems to be a very different risk appetite for our U.S. institutional clients and retail clients versus a lot of the rest of the world, maybe not the UK. And there seems to be some that are looking to put money back in, but on the U.S. staying much more defensive. We're not seeing a lot of flows into the public equity markets, maybe into the bond markets. And interestingly, one anecdote is that we're seeing lots of flows into EM equities, but I'm not hearing that from our U.S. institutional clients. So they're still sidelined. I don't know that they have that FOMO feeling quite yet.
Are they going to be pulled off their hands? They're sitting on them at the moment. What is it going to take to get them to put them to work?
Look, I don't think there's any one trigger, but one way to get people to go back into a market that has been a little bit out of favor is to not have another alternative, sort of the reverse of what we saw the last decade. So when the risk reward becomes less compelling in credit and fixed income markets, then maybe people will look back to or institutions or investors will look back to the equity markets. But I think at the moment,